Good evening to one and all present here. I welcome you all for the today's Knowledge Tuesday session. I'm Sumitra from HTIC MedTech Incubator hosting this session. Before we start the session, I request everybody to be on mute and unmute yourself when you want to say something or you want to ask some questions. We also created a feedback form link, and I will be posting the feedback form link in the chat box, requesting the participants to fill the feedback form once the session is over. This will help us to improve our upcoming Knowledge Tuesday sessions. So, for the for the today's session, the speaker is Miss Ektaba, who is a partner in Samvat Partners, and the topic for the today's session is founders agreements and investment agreements. Over to you, ma'am.
Hi everyone, good evening. Just a minute, let me just see if are
We
you
can see
able
your
to
screen, ma'am. We can see your screen, ma'am.
see my screen now?
Yes, ma'am. Perfect, ma'am.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, now let me just get to uh, just try to see. I'm not able to. Just give me a minute.
Okay, ma'am. Okay.
Just I think this is better. Now is this? Are you able to see my screen now?
We can able to see your screen, but not in a full present, not in a presentation mode, ma'am.
Okay, so let's see.
Otherwise, can I present the screen, ma'am?
Okay, that'll be fine. That's okay.
Okay,
Not a
ma'am.
problem.
Just give me 2 minutes, ma'am.
Sure.
Can you able to see my screen, ma'am?
Yeah, I'm able to see your screen.
Okay, I will put in full screen mode, ma'am.
So, hi. So today we'll actually be talking about when you look at investment agreements or founder agreements. It all comes to being, are you really investment ready? Um, have you taken what a company needs to do or an entrepreneur needs to do to see how you can actually be business ready and investment ready? So, in fact, there's a very interesting quote by Peter Drucker, who actually said that businesses once grew by two ways. It's either grassroots up or acquisition. Today, they actually go through alliances, and in alliances, when you talk about alliances, he's talking about all kinds of dangerous alliances. You can have joint ventures and customer partings, which, by the way, very few people understand, and that's actually very true because when you look at investments and you look at investment documentation, what we actually see is what's there on the newspapers when you talk about valuations, etc. But it's a double-edged sword because if you want the money, then you need to be prepared and be ready to deal with the money and handle the investors also who can come on board. Similarly, when you look at collaborations, and when I'm talking about collaborations, there could be one or more. Either it could be one or more founders, or it could be through strategic acquisitions where you have more and more senior level people who actually join in together to try and grow a business together. Again, they are relationships that are created, and these relationships are not by blood, but they're created through documentation. And there's a very thin line in terms of how you can manage these contracts and these negotiations. So today the idea is to run through, to look at the entire we're looking at it in three sections. So we talk about founder agreements. When you have partners who collaborate, founders necessarily need not be people who start the business together, but they could be partnering along the way during an entrepreneurship journey. So you have founder agreements, or also called promoter agreements. Part B will actually look at understanding what do you mean by investment agreements. And the third thing which I wanted to actually just touch upon and not go into detail is the minute you have people and you have relationships, there are bound to be conflicts. And conflicts, I don't need a dispute. It doesn't mean something that you need to go into court with, but it's about, again, conflicts, because there would be conflicts that arise from time to time. So when we start with it, this is a very interesting term that I actually came across on Wikipedia, which is called founderitis. Founderitis is basically, it's to summarize it, it's basically the founder's desire to control and to be part of the enterprise. And also sometimes what happens is that the founder grows at a larger place than the entrepreneur. And sometimes what happens is this also leads to issues. And so it's very important to see where you're looking at. The founder has to look at it, whether it's important for the founder to grow or for the organization itself. Because sometimes what could happen is that the charm or the charisma or the status of the founder itself could actually withhold the organization. So it's very important for every entrepreneur to understand when is it becoming founderitis, and when is it looking at the organization, and when it's becoming a deterrent to the organization's growth, and address those concerns. Now, when we come to questions of what is a founder's agreement, is there a standard template of an agreement? No, there's no standard templates of an agreement. The next question is, when do you start talking? There's a lot of people, they'll come to us and say, okay, fine, can you draft a founder's agreement? So the first thing that we want to ask is, have you really had a conversation with the founders as to what you're looking at? Have you got 10 things that you really want to record in the agreement? What is it that you're looking for? So the issue becomes is, when do you start having these questions? And some of the questions are very easy, and it's very easy to say, okay, fine, we want to make the company the next $10 billion company. We need to scale up. We need to employ more people. We want to look at real estate. But there are difficult questions also to be asked. When do you start asking those difficult questions? And the difficult questions start with issues. It could deal with issues like, how do we look at if one of us is not there? Because you're then talking about the mortal lives of human beings, which all of us know, but they're very uncomfortable to talk to. How are we looking at our mortality? How will our mortality have an impact on the company? Do we want our family to come into the company itself? Today we all are in this and we have a drive together. What if one of us loses the drive? And it's not an issue. So one is that, people say, how could you? Sometimes it's not really about how could you, but it's about a genuine issue that, you all come into it together, but one of them somewhere during the course of the line figures out that their lives have different paths. How do you deal with such situations? What is our trust levels? Are we, when we got in together, we've come with a focus of, from a point of view of intellect, how do we get onto it at a point of level of an emotion? Because what happens invariably when you're talking about conflicts, there's always an elephant in the room that nobody wants to interest, because it's difficult. It gets you to deal with difficult issues, and the difficult issues deal with your emotions. So when is the right time to have the question? The right time ideally should be that even before you incorporate the company, or you sign your collaboration agreements or your acquisition agreements, even before that is when you should ideally start having the conversation. But if you have this conversation once, does it stop? At least my experience in life has been that people evolve over time. Our beliefs, our philosophies, even the entrepreneurship ecosystem changes over a period of time. So if there are transactions I did 20 years ago, transactions today have a very different flavor to it. So things evolve over a period of time. And with entrepreneurs, especially startups, you will see that, from when you started your journey to when maybe you will raise your first seed fund, your business plan, your idea, everything would itself change over a, will change. So you need to keep adapting. So likewise, even conversations with your co-founders, etc., would need to evolve. You need to keep taking reality checks and saying, is this how we were looking at things? Is this how we, is this how we structure our documentation? Is this, are we still on the same page? Do we need to make some changes to our founders agreement itself? And where we look at these conversations, the easiest points to start is, what are our visions? What is our goal? What's our philosophy? What is the culture we look at the organization? And what is a broad form of ethics? You don't need to have HR policies for this. This could just be conversational conversations, which you probably record in writing and then translate into an agreement going forward. Because all of this is, what is it now? What could change it? How can it change, and how would we deal with such a change? After you look at vision, goals, philosophies, which is your macro in terms of your organization, then you need to get into micro issues. The micro issues all relate to your decision making. Do each of you have roles and responsibilities? How do you structure decision making, factoring the roles and responsibilities? Does everything need, our absolute consent of everybody on board? How do you want to give operational flexibility, at the same time keeping checks and balances on the roles and responsibilities of each of the founders? What is very critical to you that requires everybody to unanimously consent? Could some decisions be, to make sure that it's smooth and you don't have, and internal conflicts don't affect the company? Can you look at, staggering consent rights or staggering decision making rights, such that certain things are unilateral, certain things can be by majority, certain things are individual? Of course, this will all have to be done within the metrics of what the Companies Act, etc., require you to do, but you need to have those conversations. But introducing checks and balances is always very critical, because if you have power, there is a chance that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Further, if you are looking at founders handling different roles, okay, you tend to become that, I know it, this is my baby, this is the way the things do, I don't need to listen to anybody else. But then how do you fit in the logic and reasoning and the fact that you need to listen to others as well in your decision making process? So where do you say that this is an absolute right you have, or where do you draw the line and saying that this is where you need to really listen to us? And who has the word? So is it that the buck stops with one, or is the buck stops with many? The next thing is a very difficult conversation to have.
Excuse me, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am. Sorry for interruption.
No
I don't
worries.
know in which slide I'm there, sir.
Sorry, page 6. Sorry, page 6. I'm just continuing.
So can you say next, means then I can follow with you.
Sorry. Yeah. So next is,
1 second, ma'am. That slide is correct. Is this slide is correct, or I need to go forward or backward?
no, you're behind. You're gone ahead. Just a slide before this. Before this.
This?
Before
This?
Yeah, stay here.
Okay. Just say next, ma'am. So I can switch the slide, ma'am.
So the next exit is the. I not moved after this, so I'm still on this slide. So everything is in this.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just say next, ma'am, so I can switch the slides, ma'am.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
So when we come to, when you're looking at exits, and this is again this is a very difficult conversation to have, because you're dealing with something where you've started with great hope and saying that this is what it is. We are going to make this the next unicorn of the country, or maybe even global. And then you're talking about issues like, what happens if one of us leaves? When does one of them leave? How do we deal with scenarios which are inherently negative conversations, because you're looking at events that could disrupt your status of hope, but it is an important issue, because if you don't talk about them and you don't have some sort of an understanding, if you are ever faced with such a scenario, you would grapple to deal with it, to handle it. And then if you have a conflict, which is probably, it could happen in the middle of your fundraise, or it could happen in the middle of you trying to get your next big acquisition, and you suddenly have a conflict or an issue which you have to deal with among the co-founders. At that point, the business suffers significantly. And some of things are like illnesses. You could have illnesses which are, chronic illnesses which actually require one of the founders to be bedridden. How do you deal with it? They cannot involve themselves in the business of the company. Do you do a buyout of the shares? Do you say fair enough, you continue to hold your equity, but you're not involved in management, and when you recover, you can come back? Legal heirs. Legal heirs is a very, very important question that founders need to talk about. How are you looking at this organization? Is this organization inheritable? That means we started it, we will deal with it. But if we are not there, my family gets into it and takes the same senior positions that I am looking at. If I was on the board, if I'm not there, my wife or my children will step into the board as well. Because if you don't address these issues, what happens is law says legal heirs automatically inherit, and then your agreements will be legal heirs are also part of it. So how have you dealt with the scenario? Are you looking at a scenario that if you're not there, your legal heirs still have to show merit? Again, relationship between the parties. Do you have the same comfort in terms? Do the rest of the promoters or co-founders have the same bonding with the legal heirs, and the same relationship with the legal heirs to take the company forward? The third thing, which is a voluntary process, moving on. Um, you have founders who suddenly realize that, while I might have put a lot of hard work and soul in this, it's not for me. I want to do different things in life. I want to move on. You have founders who've probably started the entrepreneurship journey very early. They might have been in the early 20s. By the time they hit their 40s or 50s, they're like, I think I've done enough of this. I need to do something else in my life. I might want to get philanthropical. I might want to get into spirituality. I might want to do something very different with my skill set. This is not what I'm looking for. Do you want to make that parting acrimonious, where each of you fight and saying, how could you? And you're talking about valuation of the shares and who stays on, who goes, and how the parting has to happen? Or is it something that you've thought through and you make the decision for a partner to move on much easier, such that the business itself doesn't suffer? The next one is already an acrimonious situation. Now, if there is a conflict in terms of ideas and parties are not agreeing, you've reached a situation where there is a dispute or a conflict that is already there between co-founders. How would you deal with it? Because eventually what happens is, when you have a conflict, the situation eventually talks about who stays and who goes. And how do you try to do this in all fairness? There's no right answer to how do you do this. But yeah, there are things that, sometimes you say, okay, fine, let's toss the coin. It's not literally tossing a coin, but you actually put in bids and offers in sealed packets and throw it across the table, and whoever's given a better value is the one who tends to stay. If both of you want to stay, then can you look at some sort of a collaboration relationship where can the business be parted? Is it that is your business something that is actually divisible, that it becomes synergetic, and at the same time each of you manage your own companies? So those are questions and issues that are very business specific and people specific. So you need to figure out what works for you. The last one is an extremely uncomfortable situation, because there is pressure from external partners, and this external partners could be customers and investors. So typically, when you have a large group of founders, if they're like 4, 5 founders across, when all of you are running the organization on your own, eventually all of you are on the board, you take decisions in a particular manner. But the minute you have a third party who's coming in, they want to ideally deal with only one person. Sometimes maybe they'll say another person. They also want smaller boards. So they'll say, okay, fine, I want to have a board seat, and out of the 4 founders, only 2 should be on the board. Now, then the issue becomes, and which is a very uncomfortable question, as to who are the 2 who stay on the board, who are the 2 who exit the board. Then becomes, who is the person who becomes the point of contact insofar as your investors are concerned. So this again becomes a very difficult question to ask, because which means, who is somebody more important insofar as the investor is concerned, and what is the role, and how do the other founders then take this entire balance, or how do you balance the situation because of a demand from investors? It could be something that's valuation, otherwise if the valuation is not good, you may say, we don't want to do that. But if valuation is fantastic, the investor is somebody who can add value to your company, can take you from from seed level to immediately into the ranks of the who's who, and it's something that you seriously consider, then the founders need to figure out how do you draw the balance, because the demand has come from somebody who's external. The other important issues you founders always need to look at is, how do you look at interest when you're looking at conflicts? When you look at a parting, or when you look at somebody moving out of the company, you need to look at what is value to the company eventually. And one of the important questions is, how do you look at intellectual property of the company? How do you look at a founder exiting and starting something completely exactly similar to what you had all done together? And why IP is extremely important is because I see a lot of disputes where IP is created initially, of course, using email accounts of founders. It is lying in systems outside of the company. And when they create the company, that IP is not brought into the company. And a lot of these conflicts sometimes start even before the company takes off. So what results is, your IP itself, neither party can benefit out of the IP because it's all in dispute. You can, and so then it's very important that even sometime before you incorporate a company, if you are jointly creating IP with the intent that at some point you will do business together, record that fact in writing. Said that whatever either of us develops is joint and held joint. Okay. Okay, we can move to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay. Now, when we look at roles, responsibilities of partners or each other, we've actually gone through that. But couple of broad bullet points that you can actually have conversation about it. What is the role and responsibility? Understanding that and defining them. It's very easy to say, "Acha, you will be responsible for sales and marketing. You'll be responsible for tech and development. You will be responsible for admin and management." None of the roles and responsibilities are actually, clear firewall. They will all have interplays with each other. My business development might have an impact on tech development, because the business guys, when you go out, there could be tech requirements a customer may want, and you want to promise them, but your tech development will say, sorry, it's not possible, or it will take longer than what you want to do. So then how do you look at defining each of these roles and responsibilities? And again, while you're defining them, also try to understand each other's strengths and weakness. And this is it's a 360 degrees. So one is, it's very good to have friendships, but it's also but the minute you get into a relationship and you're trying to do deal with founders, having roles and responsibilities, you need to have these conversations. If you believe that is not, you may not be able to have this conversation openly, and you think that you might come across as harsh, get a third party who probably knows all of you involved, and have that conversation in a comfortable manner. But it's very important to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. So I'll talk about, in fact, there's somebody who I've worked with in the past, who's a fantastic lawyer and a fantastic rainmaker, who was able to do great law work and to handle everything else, but was not a good administrator. And once this person was put into a position of being a managing partner of a law firm, he collapsed because he just could not handle it. So while his strength was in terms of marketing and in terms of implementation, his weakness was absolutely admin. So while it might look good saying, I handle everything else, but it's very important for you to figure out, do you have the strength to deal with it? And if not, and if there's something that is your weakness, how can you deal with the scenario? Because if you take on responsibility, which is something which is not to your strength and capabilities, then it's not just that you would falter, but it will also have an impact on the relationship that you have with the other founders, and eventually the impact will be on the growth of your organization. Do you want to, when you're looking at the other issue, is that when you're looking at roles and responsibilities, and especially if your roles and responsibilities are linked to equity shares, that you will be entitled to X percentage of shares if you handle your role and responsibility, or if it's related to remuneration, that is expectations, can you have performance matrices set out? And performance matrices, can you have performance matrices which are fair? See, like, for trying to figure out a performance matrix for somebody who's in, say, business development and sales and marketing is easier than trying to figure out a performance matrix in somebody who's probably doing administration, or who is doing tech development. Because your business development is about money in, whereas your tech development is about, sometimes it's about just does the technology work or not. The next thing is about salary expectation. uh, how do you look at salaries? Do you take homes anything at the beginning? When do you start taking home? And if you're not taking home anything, do the founders have the ability to survive without drawing any salaries over the next couple of years? Because if they're not able to manage their lives and you're not able to take salaries for a couple of years, eventually under pressure, one of the co-founders needs to move out. The last thing, when you're looking at roles and responsibilities, it's very nice to say, I'm the founder, this is my baby, I will do everything. But at some point, you need help. You need professional people on board to help you run the show. So it's very important for the founders to also see, when do you step back and bring on a professional team? Or when do you say that, fair enough, I can do A, but for B, C, and D, we need professionals around. So this is the conversations that I think are a good starting point for founders to have. The next thing which is very important, and this is something which we will move into investment agreements with this issue, is how do you look at your cap table? When you're a single person, you're looking at 100%. But when you're looking at multiple founders, your cap table itself starts shrinking, because each of the co-founders, while collectively you might have significant chunks, but individually itself you have smaller chunks. And also, to figure out that cap table, are you looking at, capitalizing? How do you look at capitalizing for the cap table? Is there a funding commitment from any of the founders? Do some of the founders have a funding commitment plus a performance commitment? Is it only performance? How do you look at the shareholding evolve over a period of time? Do any of the founders have a larger shareholding, and how do they hold on to that larger shareholding? Are you giving, because of performance, are you giving sweat equity? That means the founders don't have to put in money. And what is the parameters of issuing sweat equity? And especially if you look at getting in strategic investors, or private equity investors coming at a later date, or if you've got angel investors who are coming in and giving you great valuations, but they're also taking a great shareholding upfront, having understandings on sweat equity and when the promoters can actually, or the founders can actually grow up the cap table, despite having investors on board, is another very important conversation to have. Things like ESOPs. A lot of people love talking about ESOPs and saying, I'll give 5% and 10% to employees for ESOPs. It's a good conversation to have, but you also need to understand that 5 or 10% will also impact your cap table. The other thing is, everybody needs to be conscious of the fact that when you get external funding in, there is a dilution that happens of your cap table. So when you have that, how do each of you look at your cap table? Because sometimes what happens is that the funding of a cap table, especially in the initial stages, you don't really clearly define between an angel funding that is coming through friends and family funding, and what is what the money the founders bring in. So because you're trying to scramble for money, you will put in a small nominal amount from yourself, but you might have extended family of yours who will put in a certain amount of money, and you say, okay, fine, this is my share. But as you grow along, and as you grow, how are you looking as an individual, as a founder who controls a company, to consolidate your own shareholding in your name, minus the friends and family who probably helped you out? Because there is a possibility of a scenario where the friends and family could have more shareholding than the founders do, and that will again tilt the balance of management and control of the company. Any questions so far, or we'll take the questions at the end?
We will take the questions at the end, ma'am.
Sure. Okay, fine. So next we go on to investment agreements. You can move to the slide which talks about page 9.
Is this slide is correct, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. So when you look at when you look in the investment process, it's very saying, okay, fine, I've got an investor on board. But the investment process itself is a time-consuming process. It starts much before you see anything in the paper, and sometimes it takes a good year or 2 years. So one is, as a founder, you need to plan when you need the funds or you require the funds, and start the process way before. So I would say that normally I would say start the process of at least hunting for an investor and making sure your company is investment ready at least a good 2 years in advance. Because your legal documentation, that is execution of the term sheet, diligence, finalization of the transaction documents, and eventually looking at closing, your legal part itself could sometimes take about 6 to 7 months. If you're lucky, it could get over in a month or two. But the process of identifying the right partner in the first case itself takes time. We can go to the next slide. Sumitra, can you take it to the next slide? Okay. So, when do you look at, when does the investment process start? When do you start talking deals and when you talk about the structure itself? The way I'm looking at it is that it's your very first interaction with the investors that sets the benchmark, because the first meeting, connect could be an email, etc. It's about how do you set and manage expectations, because one thing to remember is an investor is investing in the company to make money out of it. Okay, their goal is that exit and the IRR that they will get out of investing in the company. So they want to safeguard their investment, and that is where they're coming from. On the other hand, as a founder and a promoter, you're looking at the business growth, you're looking at getting things moving on the ground level, you're looking at keeping the company cohesive and making the company grow. So sometimes there's an inherent disconnect in terms of how both of you look at the same deal. You are trying to minimize the valuation at which you can give shares to the investor. Investor wants to make, so I'm saying basically you want to maximize the valuation, and investor wants to minimize the valuation. So they want to get a deal out of it, you want to get a higher amount. So when you're looking at that, because you will be making the first approach, how you set and manage that expectation is very important. If you actually start saying that, we can get 10x IRR within the next 3 years, when he gives you a proposal and when he says, this is what I'm looking at, he will factor what you've told him. Okay. If you tell him that, oh, my valuation is fantastic, I'm looking at a valuation growth of, within, I'll have 5x EBITDA after another 2 years, and I'm looking at growing very phenomenally, he will factor that in terms of his expectation. So what happens is then you start with a very high, setting the expectations very high. The response you'll also receive from the investor is there. And later on, when you're actually negotiating the term sheet, bridging that becomes difficult. The next thing is, this is a lot of founders, a lot of entrepreneurs ignore this. Do you need to really do a KYC, that is know your customer check, on the investor itself? As a lawyer, as a legal advisor, no matter how odd it sounds for that, I would always say yes, because eventually and it's not, this KYC doesn't have to do with the credibility of the investor. It actually has to be the investor could be very credible, but the investor just might not be the right investor for you in terms of how that investor operates and the way you operate. So it's very important for entrepreneurs also to see that whether that investor is somebody who will be a good fit for the way us as founders are, and for the business I have. Okay, you could have a great investor who's actually a REIT fund, and now REIT is basically who's into real estate investment, who's now trying to branch out into doing technology investments itself. And if you are a founder who has a very niche technology business, and you actually need somebody who's strategic, who wants to come on board, and you need that kind of guidance and push, the person who's a REIT guy may not be the right fit, because he'll understand real estate, he'll understand that very well, but technology is not something his domain. He's trying to get into it, and he looks at you as a great starting point. But for you, but as far as you're concerned, he's actually an experiment. And is that experiment right for you? And that is something you need to look at. How does it work? Because eventually, any investment is also like a marriage, and it requires a lot of adjustments to be made at both ends, more so by the company, because an investor can turn around and say, sorry, I don't agree, and you have to follow with that, unless it creates and if you don't do that, then it becomes conflict. So you need to really see that, is there a meeting of minds between the investor and the founders as well. And how do you then go about it? It's very important, again, for you to do research as well as a founder. First is understand the business space, understand who the investor is, what kind of investments have you done. Can you ask the investor to introduce you to some of the portfolio companies? Have an open conversation with portfolio companies where the investor is currently invested in and where the investor has already got an exit from. Understand the purpose, why you're requiring the capital. see that, is it something that you need over the next 3 to 5 years, and have you built your capital enough? So do you need to ask for 10 million or 20 million? Will the 10 million exhaust in 6 months, which means you have to do another fundraise? Can you ask for a higher amount and look at a lower amount? Or are you asking for too high amount where you don't need to? For the simple reason, when you ask for a higher amount and you don't need it, the investor is still going to look at the same exit price that he's looking for. So if you don't need the money and you're getting the money, um, does it put enough more pressure on you to try to get that exit for that entire amount? Which is something that you really don't want to do. So it's very important for an entrepreneur also to do a certain amount of preparation and understand whys and hows of why the entrepreneur requires the money. Evaluation. This again is something that, while nobody really talks about it, but you need to understand, because an investor will come with a set of non-negotiable terms, and these seem very, very onerous. But you need to see that if you don't get that investment in at that point, what is your worst case scenario? What are your options? How do you look at the growth of the business? Do you have somebody who can do? Do you have other sources of funding? So you need to again evaluate what is your interest vis-a-vis getting the funding. Is it only because you're using the investor as a bridge to reaching the next next level in your entrepreneurship journey? Do you really need the money? Are you desperate for the money? And if you don't accept the owner's terms, then basically the company is going bankrupt. So you need to look at it. Where do you draw the line, and how much are you willing to give up? The proposal, term sheet, letter of intent, there are several documents that come in. Read through it, get the big picture clear. Take your time and don't rush in. A lot of people sit and negotiate on semantics, or they rush in to just sign the term sheet saying, yeah, I got a term sheet, we'll see the rest of it later. Your term sheet forms the basis on which your final transaction documents are built on. So it's very important for you to understand what's there, because that is your base foundation. Having said that, yes, sometimes the final contract looks completely different from what the term sheet said, and they can be completely the opposite of the spectrum. So there's no hard and fast rule that the term sheet is what the final document will look like. But a lot will also depend on how desperately the investor requires to fund you. Are you somebody who's being chased by investors? Is your company the next big thing that's happening, so everybody's eyeing for you? So if you have a great business proposition, you have better leverage. So if you have better leverage, then you can dictate terms. Then, if you have a term sheet and your agreement, you can say, sorry, you don't want it, I have 4 others. You don't really have to do this. But if you're not and you're really desperate for money, then be very, very careful, because your final agreement will reflect what the term sheet says. And term sheets typically come with a no conflict clause, which basically says that for the period of the term sheet, you cannot negotiate or deal with anybody else. So if your term sheet is 60 or 90 days, that means for the 2 or 3 months, you cannot speak to anybody else. So if the deal doesn't go through, you have to start all over again. So the final contract, we'll go through, some of the terminology which is there. But before that, we look at, what broadly the term sheet covers. We can move to the next slide. Yeah, that's correct. So term sheets are called several things. It's called a term sheet, letter of intent, heads of agreement, or whatever you call it. Is a term sheet really needed? There's nothing in law which says a term sheet is needed. It's usually that the investors like to have a term sheet before they start spending money in terms of a diligence, and to tie down the company to certain broad understandings on commercials, and to make sure that there's this no shop clause or a no conflict clause saying that they will not speak to anybody else while the investor is considering this. How detailed should be? Again, there's no hard and fast rules. There are some term sheets which are literally 1 or 2 pages. There are some term sheets which run into 10 or 11 pages long. But it broadly talks about the transaction structure, balancing of the promoter's asks and the promoter's sentiments, which is your valuation. It'll talk about it being binding or not binding. It'll talk about the timeline for the transaction as to how long should the definitive agreements, which is your main agreements, be signed, failing which the entire term deal is off and parties can do what they want. It'll also talk about confidentiality, and we'll talk about something called as a transaction cost. The transaction costs are basically the cost, who bears the cost of the diligence and who bears the cost of the transaction documents. typically investors expect companies or the entrepreneurs to bear this cost. But again, there's no hard and fast rule. It again depends on how much you have leverage on the transaction, and you can negotiate on whether it should be full, it should be, it should be paid equally. Will it be paid only if the deal closes, or is it going to be borne even if the deal doesn't close? We can go to the next slide. Yeah. So we look at next thing is on diligence. So before any transaction happens, what is a diligence? A diligence is it's it can happen at any time, but it's basically an exercise that is done by the investors to look at what the general health of the company is. Okay, and the general health of the company could be not just from a legal perspective, but it's also from a financial perspective. So they will look at financial risks. How have you been doing your bookkeeping? Is whatever is required to be recorded in the books appropriately recorded in the books? Are there any investment restrictions? Are you in a sector which you cannot take certain investment? Is there a restriction on you transferring shares? Are there any compliance challenges? Example, you've not been paying provident fund. Um, so so even the risks and the issues that come up in legal and financial, there are the yellow risks or green risks, which are mild and which normally are then factored into the transaction documents for you to either clear before the transaction can close. And if they're really mild, the investor might say, okay, fine, this is housekeeping, it's general hygiene. Let's do this. Let's do this closing. Let's do that after the closing. We're not worried about it. The other ones are the orange to orange risks. Orange risks are typically, and even red risks, they're typically what the investors want you to clear and sort out before they even invest. So if you have a lot of the risks that fall within the yellow, orange and red risk categories, the investor will not close unless you resolve it. So what happens is that while everything might be going smoothly, and if those are time consuming actions, then your time to get the money gets longer. Then we come to the red risk. Now, red risks, the risks which are come in the red category will again divide into two things. One are deal breaker issues and one are the CP items. So CP items, which is the condition precedent items, move into the document. But if there are deal breaker issues, then the deal will just not go through. And I'll give you an example of there's a transaction that we had done where the company was in advanced talks with the investor. Term sheet is signed. They've gone ahead. Transaction documents are also under discussion, and the diligence actually threw out that they were doing a business in which foreign investment was not permitted. So they were in the business of broadcasting, and the company did not realize that they were doing that business. So the whole thing had to be done where they had to actually shut down an entire business of theirs, so that the investor could come in. So they had to actually give an undertaking to the investor that they would not do that broadcasting business. And the impact of that was that the original valuation that they looked at as a broadcasting business was actually something which had a lot of revenue. And their broadcasting business was largely news and was news related, because of which, in those days, the investors could not invest in. So they couldn't put up money in at all. So valuation significantly reduced. So the impacts of a diligence, issues in diligence will also have a direct impact on the valuation that you have. It could have, it could also mean that delays in funding, valuation adjustments. It could also mean that the investor may not look at pure equity. They may say, okay, fine, I don't want to put in the entire money today. I will only put in a part of it today. The remaining I will see depending on how you resolve these issues. So your access to capital also becomes staggered. And staggering of access to capital sometimes happens is that investors also then don't want to fund you at the second stage, because when they've tasted the flavor of coming in, they may not want to invest, which means for the next round when you need the money, you need to then go out and start the process again, which can be cumbersome and have a cost impact on the company itself. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. So when we come to investment agreements, again, investment agreements could come in several shape sizes. You have investment agreements, subscription, share purchase, because if there's a secondary acquisition also involved, then there'll be share purchase, etc. These are, so this is just, I won't go into each of these things, but your transaction documents are when you talk about transaction documents, it includes the document under which the acquisition or investment is made. It also talks about a shareholders agreement, which is an agreement in which your rights and responsibilities of all the parties are put in, and it could also include other agreements depending on how your transaction is structured. We can go to the next slide. So the next slide is where we can look at what is the kind of terminology that is used when you look at transactions. Conditions precedent we spoke about. Conditions precedent is basically things that you need to do before the transaction can close. And the conditions that get moved on are conditions subsequent. Exclusivity. So even in the transaction documents, while you sign the transaction documents, until you satisfy the condition precedent, there is no investment that happens. So investors typically look at the fact that till that closing doesn't happen, or they'll identify something called as a long stop date, which means which will be an identified date. If the transaction doesn't happen by the long stop date, the transaction falls. And so till that date, again, there is a onus placed on the founders in the company that they will not speak to anybody else with respect to any investments in the company. Representations and warranties. Representations and warranties are nothing but statements of positivity which the company and the promoters give to the investors, saying that everything is kosher with the company. We are confirming the health and hygiene of the company. We're confirming that there are no liabilities. We're confirming there are no litigations. If there is an exception to the reps and warranties, which is, suppose you're saying that I have not, if the rep and warranty says there is no, the company has not taken any loans, the company has actually got bank loans, the exceptions to that are carved out into something called as a disclosure letter or disclosure schedule, where disclosures can be given. Some of the disclosures that you give, and if they're critical, they will come down back in terms of indemnity. And indemnity is basically that if there's a loss suffered by either the investor or the company because of a representation or warranty or an obligation not being complied with in accordance with the agreement, then the promoters in the company have an obligation to pay out to the investor, or the promoters will have a obligation to pay into the investor to basically make the company as good as in terms of such that the impact of that breach is mitigated. The next thing is management. Again, you talk about how the overall management of the company will come in. So you have how the board is constituted, how the board meetings will happen, how the shareholder meetings will happen, what is the quorum for the meetings. Typically, investors are very interested in saying that there will be no meeting that will happen unless their nominees are present. You need to figure it out to what extent are you willing to give that. Where do you want to make sure that, after a certain point of time, if the investor nominee is not coming in, we can still continue with meetings. Financing the company, you're looking at preemptive and anti-dilution protection as well as dilution-related matters. This basically gives the rights to the investor, saying that whenever the company is looking at a further round of investing, then they have the right to participate in that funding. And if the funding, or if any acquisition or any transaction happens with respect to the shares of the company, either primary or secondary, below the price at which the investor had come in, they can get additional shares at a reduced price such that the price averages out. Alternatively, if the investor has convertible instruments issued, they will look at a conversion change. The conversion ratio itself will get modified such that they come on par. Decision making. Now, decision making, there is a list of matters which an investor will always put into the document, which could range from as little as 8 to 10 and can go up to about 45, 50, which are decisions that the company cannot take without the investor confirming to those. Now, this becomes a very important issue, or a very important list for the founders to look at, because this talks about where your operational powers are being restricted. So this list talks about operational flexibility vis-a-vis looking at it from the investor's interest, or safeguarding the investor's rights and investors' capital. So while finalizing this decision-making list of veto or reserve matters, you would need to look at that list very carefully and to see where you need to carve out exceptions that give you a basic operational flexibility that you require to manage the business. Every shareholders agreement will have restrictions on transfer of shares, and these restrictions will happen in different forms. So you can have, ROFO, tag and drag along. ROFO is nothing; it's a right of first offer, which basically means that before whoever wants to sell the shares has to first quote the price, and if that price is fine, then the transfer happens. Otherwise, the person is free to go out in the market and sell to at a higher price. ROFR means you first get the price from the market and then bring it to the shareholders. Tag along basically means tagging. It's very simple. It means that if somebody is selling the shares, the other shareholders have the right to attach and sell along with them. Drag along means that if the investor is selling the shares, the investor can ask the other shareholders of the company also to sell along with them. Drag along is something that the promoters need to be very careful about. If you are somebody who's very attached to the business, you may not want to agree to the drag. If you're looking at a great valuation and you don't mind the exit, then you need to make sure that the drag is at a price which is beyond an agreed valuation that you might have agreed into the documents. Put and call options are nothing but investors typically, if there is a scenario where the investor doesn't want to continue in the company, the investors will say that at that point, I can ask you to buy my shares, and that's a put. So they're putting their shares to you. Because in the situations where the promoters don't want the investors to stick around in the company, so then they want to have the right to buy out the promoters, even though the exit period is not ended, and that's called a call option because you're calling the investors to sell to you. Confidentiality, if you are in a highly sensitive business which has extreme amount of confidentiality clauses, you would need to pay attention to the confidentiality clause further, including on what information can be even disclosed at the board, because investors typically have a back-to-back information disclosure that happens. So while you'll inform the board and the investors, that information gets disclosed to information to the IC which sits maybe with a fund sitting overseas, and that might get disclosed again to the investors in the fund. So you need to be, if it's highly sensitive in terms of some data, you may want to put restrictions on the information that will even be presented to the board. Non-compete, non-solicitation. Usually there is a restriction on founders from doing anything which is not just competing with the business, but competing with the business, and even sometimes spending time outside of what they're doing with the company. So if there are carve-outs, if you have, say, family investments, or if you are doing consulting or advisory, which is not maybe identical, but in a similar field, you want to specifically carve those out. Ownership of assets, we discussed this earlier. Covenants and obligations. Covenants and obligations is nothing but things that you need to do. So it'll be like, the founders will ensure that the company is in compliance with all laws. The founders will ensure that the company provides certain, MIS and other information to the investors from time to time. Deadlock resolution. This is not very common in investment agreements, but it's very common in strategic acquisition documents or strategic investment documents. This is basically that in case a decision not be taken because of an exercise of a veto power, and the party is now not able to resolve the issue, and it results in a larger conflict between the parties. Then there's a mechanism that is built into the document where one party exits and the other one stays. Events of default is basically how do you deal with breach scenarios. Indemnity we spoke about, but indemnity can be a very generic indemnity which says that anything that happens before closing, you will indemnify us. It will be specific with respect to certain matters that you've disclosed in the disclosure schedule. There are sometimes limitations on indemnity which is factored in, which is both in terms of money and time, which could be like for tax matters, you cannot bring in the investor cannot bring any claim after the expiry of 7 years. Limitation on indemnity amount could be also sometimes be capped on, like for not a fraud, for a general operational issue, it could be limited to the amount of investment that the investor made. Then you have liquidation preference, liquidity preference. This is basically where the company is getting into a liquidation or a winding up scenario. How is the investor to be paid out, or how is the shareholders to be paid out? So there's a waterfall mechanism. So you actually build in that the investor will first get its money out. Then the other parties get it. How much do you get out? Do you have a double dip? That means do you get your money first, and then if there's a balance, do you get a share again in? So this again, for different agreements, there are different preferences, and parties need to look at it. Dispute resolution. Do I look at arbitration? Do I look at court? Where do I look at it? Am I looking at arbitration outside India, within India? Some investors have a strict policy that we cannot do it in India. It has to be outside. Then if you're looking at outside, which jurisdiction works for you? Upside sharing. This is again something which is not typical in investment agreements, But if you have great leverage and you're in a business where you really is something that investor is willing to invest in, and you already have a good running going on, investors may be willing to give you an upside sharing, which means that if you get the investor the return that you promised, and you're actually giving him more than that, then whatever the excess amount is, a part of that is then shared with the founders. Okay? So eventually, we can go to the next slide. Um, there's these two wonderful sayings that, on one hand, you talk about God being in the details, and the other hand, the devil is in the details. So whenever you look at investment agreements and how you look at transactions, you would need to look at when do you need details so there's God in it for you. That means it safeguards your interest. And where you need not to have too many details, because having the details would make it very onerous on the founders and on the company to comply with those obligations. I think I don't know if we have time to get into the next thing, because the next thing is on conflicts. Um,
Actually, we need to end it up at
Correct.
5:45, so we can have questions for
Yeah.
15
So
minutes.
we don't get into conflicts, but on
So
hello.
you can bind it up at 6 and 56 up 15 minutes. We can take the question and we can wrap it at 6:15, ma'am.
Sure. Okay, so when you get it, okay, so the next we can move to the next slide. I'll take this. I'll take this only. You can move to the next slide. So after funding, what happens? When you're getting funding, it's a relationship. Now, relationships come with, they come with their own set of baggages. Like even if you look at it within a family, whether it's between siblings or whether it's with parents and children and with spouses, there is conflicts that keep arising. But because they're family, we sort of, sometimes we deal with it, sometimes it goes very acrimonious, etc. But how do you look at conflicts? Because at every stage, you would have conflicts between ideas and thinking that come about. So how do you look at it? We can go to the next slide. Okay. So in every contracts, there are certain clauses in contracts which are more which are more dispute prone areas. It could be your performance obligations. It could be enforceability. It could be things which we have agreed to agree at a later point in time. Those are all things which are very dispute prone areas, and therefore we need to look at, and those are issues, and those are places where eventually that you need to focus on when you're looking at any relationship. So reserve matters is again a very conflict prone area when it comes to relationship between investors and founders. We can go to next slide. So every conflict actually has a path of escalation. It starts with mere differences, and if it's not handled at a certain point, it actually gets into, finally, when you're talking about war, is when you're actually landing up in court, and that is detrimental to the business. So the issue is that how do you look at identifying those differences, at the difference disagreement or even at the problem space, and stop it from actually getting into a full blown dispute. We can go to the next slide. So if you look at any negotiation class, or if you have negotiation as a subject, eventually the same tools will come in handy when you're even looking at managing conflicts, because every dispute or every conflict, there is a position that people take and there's an underlying interest. So for an entrepreneur, you always need to be very clear that the investors will always have an underlying interest of getting an exit and a valuation. And they are also under pressure from their investors. So when you're looking at positions and interests that you're taking and investors are taking, you need to look at and trying to balancing things so that your business doesn't suffer. You need to be very clear to figure out what is your underlying interest and what is the underlying interest of the investor, and what are the positions you are taking accordingly. You can go to the next slide. This is again a conflict triangle, which, no matter what the issue is, you have two people, you have a process, and there's a problem. But, no matter what the conflict is, eventually it's all about people. So you need to work. So you will have, your investor will have directors on board. There will be a nominee sitting somewhere, and they're the people who are interacting with you. So whenever you look at any conflict or an issue, it's about the people. So you need to make sure that you understand the pulse of the people whom the fund, because the fund or the investor will probably just be a business entity, but it will have people on board. People will change. People will have different responses. So how do you factor and deal with those people becomes very important for an organization when it comes to handling and managing any conflicts going forward after funding. Next slide. Yeah, we can. I have questions. Sorry, I stretched it a little, a little long.
Okay.
Thank you. Been
So we
very
have
patient.
some questions in the chat box, ma'am.
Yeah,
The
let
first
me look at this.
question is
Yeah.
Sinu. So Sinu, you can unmute yourself and you can go ahead with your question. Sinu? I think
Yeah, can you hear me?
yes, Sinu.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So just a doubt, might be it not covered in this point, but if I have two product in my company,
Right.
and one product I have certain people I have to give ESOPs, and the
Yeah.
other product I want to give certain ESOPs. I don't want a two company.
So, but you can give ESOPs, but what you can do is you'll have to give the ESOPs benchmarking it to the valuation of that business channel. So, if one business channel has X and the other one has Y, you need to figure out can you give ESOPs to them accordingly, because eventually, it's ESOPs are given with respect to one company. So, your ESOP plan will have to be structured accordingly.
Oh, okay. Is it a good idea to divide it into two company or?
See, there's no hard and fast. So you'll have to look at what you're looking for. Because if you have two businesses, are they businesses that are related to each other? That if you separate them, that the business will suffer. How will it impact the valuation? Because see, tomorrow, even when you're looking at investment, you'll get the investment for one company, even if they're two businesses. You cannot get the investment separate.
Okay.
You can always do investment. You can always have a parent subsidiary relationship also. So it doesn't have to. You might have two companies, but they don't need to be parallel companies. You could have company A, and company A sets up a subsidiary called company B.
Okay. So, what is that subsidiary companies? How it is?
So your company A. So if you have, say, one of your businesses you have, which is a primary business, you keep it in the company in which you have shareholding. Then that company has shares in the second company.
Okay.
Okay. So,
Okay,
but
I
only,
hope.
but I think all these things you can structure it differently. You can even sort of get in touch with me later. We can have this long chat on this afterwards.
Yeah, sure, sure. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Sinu. So the
Yeah.
next question from Meha Nambiar. So Meha Nambiar, you can unmute yourself and you can go ahead with your question.
Um, are non-compete clauses enforceable when it comes to co-founders?
So non-compete, if they're reasonable, it could be, because you cannot give an absolute restriction. So any absolute restriction on trade is unenforceable. But if you have if you've reasonably drafted your non-compete clause, it will be enforceable. And also, what happens is when you're exiting a company. So if you look at the restrictions on trade and transfer, it says that if there's a non-compete which is related to sale of goodwill, okay. So if you have an exiting co-founder, okay, that non-compete then will be enforceable, because the exiting co-founder would have sold a part of the shares or be exiting a business and will be leaving the goodwill behind.
Noted. Thank you, ma'am.
The next question, Divanshu. Divanshu, you can unmute yourself and you can go ahead with your question. Divanshu.
Yes, yes, I'm there. What I wanted to ask was, what is generally the compensation structure for if the founder leaves after a year or 1.5? So they still hold the equity, and we know that initially they would have been paid less because they had just started. So how does that look like?
See, this is again, there's no hard and fast answer. Say some people saying, because you're leaving. So there are two ways to look. One is you value the contribution that they're given and they're leaving. Okay. The
Okay.
second one is where you say you're leaving us in between. You're leaving us in the middle of all this and leaving. Okay. So one's a positive statement where you're saying that I need to compensate you at a certain price. The other one says is you're actually, this is a detriment to a company, so I should not be paying you any compensation. So depending on which
Mm-hmm.
bucket you fall, there is a compensation mechanism. So one is the value of shares. Is the exiting founder going to leave his shares, continue to hold his shares? If he's going to continue to hold his shares, then will he get the valuation appreciation of the shares? Then do you really need to compensate him additionally? Second thing is, can you then say that because you're exiting and you've not taken any salary or anything over the period of time, we are paying a one-time payment, etc. But then but that's a negotiation point that the founders need to.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. Okay. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Devanshu. So next we have couple of questions from Gyana Krishnan. Gyana Krishnan, you can unmute and you can go ahead with your question if your network is okay. You have Gyana Krishnan? Okay, I can read his questions.
Okay.
So the first question he asked, how can you link the shares to motivate the managerial team? And what are the other measurable other than sales turnover, production target, accident year, saving done compared to the previous year, and etc.
See, other measurables, I think a business person will be able to answer in terms of how you look at measurables. Typically, you have stock options which are issued that if you have, if you've been around for a couple of years and, you meet a certain managerial criteria if you've been promoted, you're entitled to stock options which a company gives. Some companies don't want to dilute their shares, so they actually even issue something called a phantom stock, where no shares are issued. It's just that the valuation of the stock is done at a particular time, and the value benefit of that is given to the employees. Okay, but but linking shares is sweat equity, ESOPs. Those are the only things. But remember, all these dilute your cap table. So as a founder, you need to be very clear that how much you want to give to the employees as well. And is it only in terms of compensation because you want to give them a money? There could be measurables also. Other than that, it could measurables could also be that if you're in a business where you want to get visibility, how many articles are you writing? Have you mentored people? And if you've mentored, then what is the feedback that the mentee or employees have given to you? So there could be other things, and there could be innovative structures. And somebody who's actually in HR can actually figure out how you can measure something which is not necessarily very tangible. The next question of Gyana is, does detailed research on investor very important to run the enterprise? It's not important to run the enterprise, but it's very important when you're looking at getting an investment on board. Okay. So you're running the enterprise depends on your relationship. So once an investor comes on board the company, the relationship between the investor and the founders becomes very important, and that actually supersedes any document you might have. But if the relationship is not good, or it's uncomfortable, then you'll start looking at every clause in your agreement. Typically, when investors they give you a standard agreement that they have, which is standard for every company that they invest. But those agreements are negotiable. But the amount that they can how much an investor will negotiate depend on two things. One is how much they have been authorized to negotiate on. Second thing is what leverage the founders have. Now, if you look at a large organization, a multilateral organization, they may, because of the kind of chain of hierarchy they have, they may be able to negotiate on a very, very few points on their documents. But if you look at somebody who doesn't have a very high chain, a long chain of command, they will be free to negotiate on several others. Okay. What happens if smaller companies are acquired by bigger companies? What happens to investor in such cases? Does he have a smooth exit? It depends on the valuation. Sometimes the investor is the one who actually puts together the entire deal, and they walk away with a great valuation. Sometimes it is because of the small company is not doing very well and it's buyout. Still, the investor typically makes an exit, unless the investor wants to look at the larger company as well. Then he looks at it as a swap, or into moving into the larger company, or he puts the obligation on the larger company to provide him an exit at a later date. So that again, there is no hard and fast things. So you could have an exit, or the investor could even continue. In a private limited company, that's next is Innovate.
Solutions.
Yeah.
So you can unmute and yourself, and you can go ahead with your question in Ag Solution.
Yeah, thanks, Sumitra. So the question is, in a private limited, would a shareholder sell their shares to anybody they want in case there is no that ROFR and RFO?
So typically, so in a private limited company, the transfer of shares is subject to the consent of the board, and the process of that is set out in the articles. Now, if you look at the standard articles, if you look at the Companies Act, there's a table F. Table F will actually tell you what sort of things are there. Usually they say that, either, so two ways. Normally, if you look at standard articles which don't have investors, even in those articles, it says that if anybody wants to sell their shares, they have to tell the board, and the board will figure out who to sell. Or they say that if somebody wants to sell the shares, they have to first offer it to all the existing shareholders before they can sell. So those clauses are anyway inbuilt into the articles of a company in which even investors are not there. So the difference between a private limited and a public limited company is that the shares of a public limited are considered to be freely transferable, that you cannot really have any unreasonable restrictions on it. If there is a reasonable restriction, then of course, even there are disputes that arise. But in a private limited company, it is the board which controls the transfer. But yes, technically, if the board approves, you can sell your shares to whoever you want.
Thank you, Ekta ma'am.
So we have another question from Pariti Govindaraju. Pariti Govindaraju, you can unmute and you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. So, my question is really regarding valuation.
Parati, you're soft. I can't really hear you.
Oh, sorry. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah. So, my question is regarding valuations of the company at the early stage, typically with regards to their first institutional investment. So, when there's no revenue, how do you go about valuations of the company? And from a founder's perspective, the concern is always you don't undervalue the company and dilute more than necessary. So, are there any legal mechanisms that we can put so that the valuation can be done at a later stage, of an appropriate manner, when more information is available, or what other options do we have?
Okay, so Parati, first is don't underestimate the value of IP. Okay, even if you're not revenue generating, there is always value in your IP. So what happens is that if you're not able to, really figure out the valuation of a company, first is you should at least have a bottom benchmark. Figure out that if you're looking at investment, you may not know the actual valuation or the true value of the company, but there is a base level below which you're not willing to get an investment. Okay, that is a benchmark you should at least set out, and that you can do on the basis of what ideas you have without setting your numbers too high. What is the value if you had no business but you had to just sell that IP of yours? What money would you make?
Okay.
So that I think your IP valuation becomes very critical there. The second thing is that if you're looking at investment, so we have so if you're looking at a company, you have two kinds of shares. You have equity and you have the preferred kind. So or preference shares, or you have I'll call it convertible instruments. Convertible instruments are two kinds. You have debentures, which is as debt in the books of the company till they convert into equity, and you have preference shares, which are part of the capital of the company, but they are also converts at some point into equity. They can also be optionally, so it doesn't have to be compulsory convertible. They could be optionally convertible, where they either convert or they will be returned, and you have redeemable, which means they never convert; they just get paid out as cash. Now that is a mechanism of using an optional or of a convertible instrument. You can actually look at the value. So when you take the investment, you take the investment and you can put a large base value depending on what you're looking at in terms of valuation. You give an investment and the investor invests as a convertible instrument. And over a period of time, and that time can be defined by you in the agreement itself. It could be like 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, it can go up to 5 years, which is usually the exit period when the investors are looking at. And you can say, let's look at what our books are like. And you want to look at only a 1 year, or you want to look at over 2-3 years. And you can say, let's see what kind of revenue we've generated. And then we will put together a formula, which is again defined in the agreement, which says that this is my actual valuation. And that is the true value at which the investor's shares will then get converted into equity.
Okay. So your recommendation is to get some sort of convertible notes at the moment when you are not so sure.
Depending, see, convertible notes, you have to be eligible to issue convertible notes, because only if you are a startup you can do that. But if there are but even if you're not eligible to issue a convertible note, you can always issue a convertible debenture or convertible preference share.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Praniti. So, since we are nearing 6:15, as I said, we can wrap it. So, thank you, ma'am, for spending your time. It was really useful and informative session. I hope the participants also been informative through this session. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I said anybody has any questions, they can even connect offline with me. I will just. Okay, and my number is okay. If I don't pick up the calls, just text me and I will then respond, because sometimes I'm on conference calls, etc., and I leave my phone behind. I don't carry my phone when I'm there. But please feel free to reach out to me if you have any doubts, any clarifications. Happy to respond. Sumitra, even the PPT you can share it with whoever has attended, so that at least they have the terminology with them. It will be useful for them.
Okay, ma'am. But as a practice, we usually upload the session video in our YouTube channel. So we can upload this session video in our YouTube channel. Hope
That's
that
fine. That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
And yeah, the other thing is, Archana, for books, etc., I can send across a couple of articles links. I'll email that separately, and then you can circulate to everybody.
So thank you, ma'am. Thank you to all the participants. Have a good evening. Thank you, ma'am.
Take care. Bye. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Bye.